Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, I know that last week you went to Disneyland, and I went a little earlier this year, so let's compare notes. What do you think?
I think I mentioned last week when talking about it. This was a post-cancer trip for my mom, and I asked her where did she want to go, and she wanted to go to Disneyland. So like any good son, I set it up to go to Disneyland, and I gulped when I saw how much it cost to go to Disneyland for 4 days. So we drove there and got there on a Sunday. A week ago Sunday, and then we were there for 4 nights, and we drove home on Thursday. So the first night, we were just there. We didn't have tickets because we got in later in the day. So we had tickets for Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So we went to Disneyland 2 days, and we went to the California Adventure 1 day. I would say, number one, if you're going to go, it's worth staying at the Grand Californian because you're right there. It's an excellent hotel. The service is exquisite. Everything about it is fantastic. It's even better than you would think it would be. So it's worth spending the bucks to go there. And we were able to do cool things like we got a room. Well, first of all, we got the room that had all the grab bars and everything in the bathroom. So that was good. But we got a room that faced the Disneyland fireworks so we could sit from the balcony and watch the fireworks and have wine and not have to be amongst the masses. So that was very good. I was surprised by how many people were there on a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And I guess there were a lot of kids who are just about to graduate from high school. So I guess that's a big thing to go there to celebrate your high school graduation. So that struck me was, I would think on a Monday or Tuesday the crowds would be down, but it seemed as crowded as could be. It was enjoyable. It's very conducive for people in a wheelchair, so that was good to see. We were able to kind of come back, and if you're in a wheelchair, you can go and get a time to come back, so you don't have to wait in line. And you pretty much go in the exit with the wheelchair to go on the ride, so that was good. But we kind of played it. We had a nice lunch. We walked around. We went on a few rides. And then at like 3 or 4 o'clock, we'd go back to the room and have nap time and have wine, and then go out for dinner. And that worked great. I don't know how these parents do it that they're running around the entire day. I saw parents out there 7 a.m. going into the parks. I don't know that I could do that. But it was very enjoyable. We enjoyed it a lot. The one thing I didn't like was the Star Wars bar because it was kind of cool and kitschy, but they just pack you in to make money. They just pack you in. We got a seat because my mom couldn't stand at the bar, which is the cool thing you want to do. So you can get a seat at a booth. They wanted to pack a booth that would seat comfortably 8 or 9 people. They wanted to pack 15 people into that booth. And I just thought, you know what, that's too much, and my behind isn't moving, is what I told the lady. Every time they wanted to squeeze 2 or 3 more people in. And in fact, one couple got up and left because they just thought this is too much. So that part I didn't like very much, but otherwise I thought it was very enjoyable. Now, how does my story compare with what you experienced?
Pretty similar, Tim. I went on a weekend and it was pandemonium considering that it was a rainstorm for, I would say, 2/3 of the day. My feet were soaking wet the entire day. And there were just piles and piles of people, even given the rainstorm. And I really wanted to go to the Star Wars bar because, hey, it's a Star Wars bar. I didn't make reservations like you, so I was able to go in after standing in a long line and standing up, but it was not a good experience. It was just loud and really it's overplayed. If you don't feel nostalgic about going to the Star Wars bar, I wouldn't recommend it. But overall, I like the California Grand. What I loved about it was that you could just go down the elevator and walk outside, and there you are in Disneyland or California Adventure. No parking the car, no going through all that stuff in the front of the park. So that's all good and totally worth it. And I hadn't been in decades. I went with my high school 3 female friends, and we all had a wonderful little reunion. It was very nice. And, Disneyland is Disneyland. It's still a wonderful place to be.
I will say, too, that's the best thing about staying there is you're literally right there. And the service at the hotel is second to none. Excellent. They're on it. They anticipate everything. Couldn't be more helpful. The checking in and checking out was fantastic. It's a bit of a to-do to get your car out. And we valeted the car and, wait for the bellman to get all your bags eggs out. They have that down like a science. So everything about that was truly excellent.
Well, so let's go on from the happiest place on earth to a place that, well, is not so very happy. So the legislature has been going through about 900 bills, I'm reading. And one of the big ones is this crime package. Assembly Bill 2943, and this is to try to curb all this retail theft that's always on TV. I mean, it's really a travesty what's happening. So AB 2943, authored by Chavez Zabur, and Speaker Rivas. Basically, it creates a new crime targeting these serial retail thieves with a penalty of 3 years behind bars for possession of stolen property with the intent to resell that property. And I think it also clarifies that, similar burglaries and robberies of different victims, they can aggregate them all together and charge them with grand theft. So listeners probably know we've talked about this past and written about it. There's this big initiative probably coming out on the November ballot that's going to toughen up some of the more relaxed aspects of Prop 47. So there's going to be longer sentences. They're going to mandate drug rehabilitation. Fentanyl is going to be a felony. Yeah, folks, possession of fentanyl was a misdemeanor or is a misdemeanor. So Tim, I'm curious, what do you think about reading that the legislature is leery of the initiative? And so they've got this package, which Newsom is ready to sign. So why not get behind both the initiative and this legislative package?
I think two things. I think number one, Prop 47 has become a sacred cow for the left. And so they cannot go along for anything that would change it. And so you hear from Newsom on down, they actively oppose anything to change Prop 47. And so whoever their key left-wing supporters, that's a non-starter for them. These sort of things with retail theft and other issues that we've seen that are kind of unintended consequences, well, I would argue the people behind those measures, they probably weren't unintended consequences for them. They want these kind of changes on the book. So I think there's that they would get into real heat from some of their key left-wing supporters. I think the other thing is it's all about power. They don't want the last check on the legislature's power is through the people at the initiative process. And they're desperately trying to do everything to get this measure off the ballot to make a deal, because now we don't know how it's going to go. It's going to be a very hyper-democratic voting base in November, but it seems like the stars are aligning that voters are going to pass this initiative. And if that's the case, all these things that you talk about that are reasonable and long overdue changes are going to become reality. And liberal legislators just can't tolerate that. So I think it's both a power thing and I think it's a political thing that they would catch heck. And so they're trying to push these bills that are kind of lipstick on a pig. They know these things need to be changed and corrected. But the issue is, as our Steve Smith has written about, Prop 47 says if you make any changes here, you have to go back to the voters. And they're trying to put lipstick on a pig, but as Steve has written, as the DAs have written, you have to go back to the voters to make these changes. This isn't going to pass muster in the legislature. So it's a little bit of them having their cake and eating it too. They can say we passed all these changes, but yet a court is going to immediately invalidate this law. You have to go to the voters to change this law. And that is, just something they don't want to deal with. So the real question will be, if they don't make a deal that satisfies the proponents of the initiative to pull it from the ballot, what are all these people going to do on the initiative? Are they going to actively oppose it? And we'll see.
Yeah, that's a very politically strange situation when you're opposing the toughening of Prop 47. It would be a bad look on their part.
And as we've discussed, the Public Safety Committee has been the biggest source of frustration for Democrats in both houses. And so they just want to have this issue go away and deal with it. And they feel like this is, well, we can deal with this. We can go along with this. But the issue is any judge is going to take this up and throw it out. So, and they would never get 2/3 vote in the legislature for a constitutional amendment to fix this. So, if you don't pass this initiative, you're essentially not going to make any change to the law at all.
So from the crime bill to this other bill, thanks for pointing it out to me. This bill is on homework, everyone. So, yep, the Assembly passed a bill to require schools to adopt homework policies that would factor in students' stress levels and their well-being. So this proposal was inspired by Assembly member Pilar Schiavo's daughter, and she brought it up during the legislature's hearing on the Select Committee on Happiness. So Californians, Tim, are among the worst performing students in the country. They need more homework, not less.
That's right. I mean, I would be more happy too if the legislature didn't take up bills like this. Is it a wonderful thing that she listened to her daughter and her daughter inspired a bill? Of course, we can see that. That's great. But you're exactly right. We should be making sure that students are prepared to succeed in the STEM fields. And they're going to need more homework, not less. And yeah, school is stressful. What in life or in the working world isn't stressful? So really, we should be focusing on ways to help them deal with the stress. And that doesn't mean taking away homework and ensuring they're less prepared to get into college or meet the demands of the workforce. And, a bill like this, it's cutesy. But what struck me about it is that literally no one voted against it, had no opposition. And I just think that's silly, as much as you don't want to, take on Pilar Schiavo's daughter. This is a dumb idea. And someone should stand up and say no. It's another example of how out to lunch the legislature is.
And it's just a ridiculous example of government overreach. Legislators in Sacramento are telling teachers what to do and getting into the classroom. Hopefully it won't pass, but you never know here in California. So another bill you like, Tim, is it might actually be okay now, if this bill passes, that California cities and counties are able to designate entertainment zones where people can drink alcohol.
It's interesting. It's an interesting one, right? I mean, we would all, as responsible adults, we might enjoy such a thing, right? That you go to, maybe you go bar hopping and you can go from bar to bar with a drink in your hand, kind of like they do in New Orleans. Or maybe you can have more kind of sidewalk dining, where you could have, bars more outside or food and drink more outside. There certainly are some unintended consequences of the bill. And, would it kind of legalize homeless people drinking in the streets? Although I don't think we're exactly citing very many homeless people for drinking in the streets. But it's there's definitely a there and an interesting idea, and I think could be conducive to a Friday night or a Saturday night experience, in any, certainly in big and medium-sized cities in California.
I'm thinking public parks, where if you wanted to hold an event or, a small restaurant wanted to have a tasting, or even PRI, having a little event, and we wanted the overflow to be on the sidewalks of our office, I think it could be a good thing. And, I'm for it, so long as, the proper permitting and the occasion allows for it.
That's right. Oftentimes you see a street might be closed off for fairs and festivals. This would be great for that too, on a more regular basis, where you don't have to, it's a to-do to close off a street, both for drivers and for, the people putting on the events. You could have more of these kind of, you see them, these pop-up little fairs and festivals. You could have more of those on a regular basis.
Speaking of wine and alcohol, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have a wonderful event in Napa Valley at the Meritage Resort on the June 25th with Victor Davis Hanson. Victor Davis Hanson, as many of you know, is a military historian and a classics professor here in California, and he's going to talk about the threats to America, both domestic and foreign. And this is really filling up fast. So if you haven't already bought your ticket, please attend. We'd love to see you.
Yeah, and this promises to be a great event. So go to pacificresearch.org/events for the first of what will hopefully be regular events in Napa. It's going to be a beautiful setting, and you're going to hear one of the most interesting thinkers on what's going on in California. So this week's podcast is a presentation of a recent luncheon we had with Batya Ungar-Sargon, who is the opinion editor at Newsweek And she has a terrific new book out called Second Class: How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. And she spoke at a PRI luncheon in San Francisco recently about her new book. And she profiles some of these working men and women who have been neglected by the political elites of both parties. And she talks about who these people are and their stories. And really, what's interesting is you might have an image of your mind of who these people are, but they're not who you think they are. So her telling the story of the people that she met is very interesting, and the way she went about choosing these people. So it's a very interesting topic, very relevant for our time right now in our politics. I think you'll be very interested to hear what she has to say.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, PRI. I always feel a little bit like when they let me into the free market spaces, like I've sort of snuck in, and I'm really excited to be here and very humbled at the invitation. And thank you again, Ken, for the books. It's really so exciting to see my books out in the wild, and I hope you'll all enjoy it. So I wanted to tell you about two women who I met while reporting my new book, Second Class: How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. I traveled around the country for a year interviewing working class people from across the political spectrum to find out, whether they thought that they still had a shot at the American dream, and if not, why not? So I interviewed many, many working class people, and I want to tell you about two of them. Amy lives in Florida. She is a certified nurse's aide. She's married to a woman, Janet, and they live in a home owned by Janet's mother, an evangelical Christian. They are the kind of couple that takes in strays, stray dogs, grandchildren from children they had in marriages before they met each other, a developmentally disabled nephew whose mother struggled from drug addiction and for whom Amy found a job in the kitchen at the nursing home where she works. Let me tell you a little bit about Amy's views. Amy does not like welfare. She is a firm believer that people have to work for a living. She's been at her job for 33 years, and she is very proud that her nephew works instead of living off of disability, which he could very easily do. Amy does not believe children should be allowed to undergo gender transition. She thinks parents who bring children to drag shows should be put in prison. She opposes abortion on demand. She opposes funding the war in Ukraine, and she opposes the open border. But Amy votes for Democrats, though she says that Trump undeniably put money back in her pocket. And her wife voted for Trump because she liked that he couldn't be bought. Why is someone whose views are so conservative a Democratic voter? You might be wondering. It's simple. Amy is the steward of her union at her shop, and she can't get a meeting with a Republican to save her life. And you might be wondering why Amy is in a union. Well, without the union, she'd be making $10.40 an hour. And her union got her and her fellow CNAs up to $18 an hour starting salary. So that's why Amy's in the union. Now let me tell you about Linda. Linda lives in West Virginia, where she drives a van for Amazon. It's the best job she's ever had, and she's had many jobs. She dropped out of high school at 15 after getting pregnant, and she has worked ever since. She and her husband lost their home in 2000 after the factory he worked at all his life was shipped overseas to China. Things were very tough after that. The couple got into a mountain of credit card debt. But slowly, Linda is paying it off. And she believes that with her wages from Amazon, she might even be able to buy a bit of land in the coming years and put a double wide on it. That's her American dream. And she feels that she's on her way to getting there. Let me tell you a little bit about Linda's views. Linda is extremely pro-gay. She was extremely upset when her sister kicked her nephew out of the house when he came out to her. And Linda made it very clear to her nephew that she would always stand by him. She was raised in the South, where her family had views about race that she did not share, and she is proud that the country has so firmly moved in a new direction. Linda is furious at corporations for raising prices and contributing to inflation. She can't afford frozen pizza anymore. She's furious about homelessness, especially homeless veterans, and doesn't understand how such a rich country can allow its vets to be treated this way. She doesn't support the U.S. funding the war in Ukraine. She thinks it's appalling that hardworking lower-income people can't get access to help with groceries or car payments. Needing a car to get to work, it's not a luxury. Excuse me. She believes that both parties have abandoned the working class. Our political system is designed to enrich the rich and plunder the middle class and the working class. This is what Linda believes. Now, you might think that with her class consciousness and her support for government intervention in the economy, Linda would be a Democrat. But thank you so much. Linda is not. Linda hates both parties, but she really likes Trump. She can point to the specific policies she felt helped hardworking Americans get ahead in the Trump economy, reshoring manufacturing, trade that favors the US, and in general, putting money back in the pockets of working people so that they can take care of themselves. I'm telling you about Linda and Amy because they represent what I found throughout my year reporting second class. If I had described these two women to you and said, I spoke to a Trump-loving West Virginian woman who works for Amazon, and I spoke to a Biden-voting gay certified nurse's aide in Florida, you probably would not have expected their views to be so similar, and yet their views are almost indistinguishable. Their views on policy, their social views, their views on culture, they agree. I struggled to find something or to recall something that they disagreed about. I spoke to people from across the political spectrum while reporting my book, people of different genders and races and family structures and religious creeds from all over the country. And yet, despite the radical diversity of America's working class, I found a surprising consensus when it came to ideology, as you can see in the stories of Amy and Linda. Though Amy voted for Biden and Linda voted for Trump, there was very little that distinguished their views either on social issues or on economic issues. On both, their views fell somewhere between the two political parties, with the elites on either side actively undermining the things that working people feel most strongly about. And this was true across the board from the people that I interviewed, and the polling really backs this up. You know, people tell us over and over that we're a nation divided between left and right, when the truth is that when you look at the polls, even on issues like abortion, 70% of Americans are somewhere in the middle with real consensus over even the most contentious issues. We're often told that America is a nation divided. Politicians and media figures constantly bemoan what they call near historic levels of polarization, painting a nation with left and right at each other's throats. In some ways, they're right that there is a divide in America. But it's not between left and right. It's between an extremely polarized elite and a surprisingly united working class. One of the most universal things I heard from working class Americans was the value of hard work. I can't think of a single person I interviewed who didn't tell me that working hard is a value they learned as children and is central to their identity. Work means dignity and independence and autonomy and pride and freedom. It means having something no one can take away from you, even when work is scarce and even when the conditions aren't ideal. The Marxist view of work as inherently exploitative, something people would ideally be freed from, has taken on new life on the American left, as well as in some places in the free market right, where ideas like universal basic income have become more and more popular. But the working class Americans I spoke to over the past year did not view work as exploitative. They viewed the value of hard work through an almost spiritual lens, as though it were a precious inheritance that continued to connect them with their parents, who as children they saw getting up every morning and going out to provide for their families. It is essential to how they see themselves as Americans and a great source of pride, no matter what they did for a living. One of the things that you hear all the time is nobody wants to clean toilets. And it's just such a disgusting elitist thing to say. You'll meet in my book people who get a lot of dignity from being a janitor and are, for that pride they take in their work, are treated with the utmost disdain from people on both sides of the political spectrum. The flip side of the dignity of work is the impatience that most of the people I spoke to have for people they view as choosing not to work and living off of government benefits, and the corresponding inability of working families to get the little help they need, which would make their lives so much more stressful. So they felt like there are a lot of people living off the government and choosing not to work and getting a lot of help, and they hated that because they knew people who were doing that. But they also felt extremely frustrated that they could not get a little bit of help to get through these tough times. They didn't think big government was the answer and spoke frequently about government waste and welfare fraud, things they saw a lot of firsthand, What they did want was a system that rewarded those who work hard, who still can't get a foothold in the middle class. As for who could get them there, I found deep distrust of both political parties. The Democrats were seen as the party of the educated elites and the dependent poor, the party behind the mechanism that conveyed their hard-earned tax dollars to people defrauding the system, but also the side that had developed a kind of war on masculinity that was also a war on the physical kinds of labor that exist in the working class. And those things really go hand in hand. But the Republicans were seen as the party of the rich, the party of corporations, the side, as people would put it, pimping out the working class to achieve the goals of conservative elites. The breakdown of the American family was very much in their mind tied to the breakdown of an economy in which a man can sustain and support a family on a single income. And I think for conservative audiences, this is really important to keep in mind. You can have as your top priority tax cuts, or you can have as your top priority strong American families in which a man can support and sustain a family. And, it's sort of like there's a choice that has to be made right now, and people are desperate, and they're desperate for a party to recognize them. And the first party that does so is going to have a reigning majority. And so all of the other things you care about are going to sort of come as well by the wayside. The majority of the people I spoke to have views that don't fit with either party, whether liberal or conservative. Most people I spoke to supported significantly limiting immigration, but also majorly expanding access to healthcare. They supported gay marriage and were in general very pro-gay, but very, very worried about the spread of transgender ideology, especially in schools. So in the elites, there's this kind of LGBT unit, right? It's like gay and trans and whatever, and they did not identify with that at all. They did not see these two things as together. I met a lot of Christians who have a gay person in their life who they want treated with respect and dignity. And I met a lot of Democrats who were working class who were very upset about the trans issue and felt that it was very, very dangerous and exploding in a way that was very harmful to children. They were anti-woke, but it was not a topic they thought a lot about. Instead, they thought a lot about housing and why they couldn't afford it. An extreme moderation, tolerance, and practicality threaded itself through their views. For example, I heard often from women that they personally opposed abortion and would never get an abortion, but they would also never judge another woman for making a different decision, and they were very opposed to abortion bans, including the working class people I spoke to who vote for Republicans. Most of all the people I spoke to across the board were appalled at the divisiveness of our politics when they themselves were part of such a political, ideologically, racially, and religiously diverse world. Working class Americans simply do not have the luxury of hating people for their beliefs, nor do they have the appetite for it. I also found a deep, deep sense of betrayal, whether people voted for Democrats or Republicans. They felt that they had been left behind, abandoned to fend for themselves in an economy that no longer saw their hard work as worthy of respect and the most basic tenets of a middle-class life. And whether they were Democrats or Republicans, they kind of blamed the same people, the people behind the offshoring of manufacturing and the importing of millions and millions of migrants, the people behind free trade deals, which people brought up a lot. People brought up NAFTA a lot. And, I don't know how often we think about trade as the people who are sort of in the kind of more elite places, people whose jobs are in the knowledge industry. But working class people think about trade a lot. And they want trade that prioritizes American workers. And this is whether they vote for Republicans or whether they vote for Democrats. They were furious about the ballooning administrative costs of healthcare and education. And I think healthcare is extremely important. You mentioned healthcare in the introduction. And I just think that, for Republicans, for conservatives, finding a way to bring down the cost of healthcare would give you a ruling majority. There's no to it. It is the one area that working class people think Democrats are better on. And the working class people who were still Democrats, they felt held hostage by this because at least the Democrats are talking about healthcare. The people who defunded vocational training, they were very upset about that. We give $200 billion a year to institutions of higher education to mint the kind of people who are doing these campus protests in favor of Hamas. And we give just $1 billion a year for vocational training to train plumbers and electricians and pipe fitters, skilled tradesfolk who we desperately need in this country. There's a huge dearth. We just don't give any training to that. So in short, the elites under whose auspices the class divide has emerged in a country that likes to think of itself as classless. This is who they blamed for the fact that they could not achieve the American dream. This class divide has become entrenched. Having a college degree is predictive of how long you'll live, how likely you are to own your own home, how healthy you are, and whether your children will be better off than you. As the economists and Case and Angus Deaton have pointed out, mortality itself is diverging by education. The class divide has become the defining characteristic of American life in the 21st century. Yet the working class is a cipher in American politics and media. Despite the fact that the largest share of Americans are working class, their voices have essentially been erased from the public sphere and from public debate. Who is the American working class and who are the elites? Well, the real dividing line in America, I found, is the one that separates out credentialed degree holders in professional or managerial jobs in the knowledge industry, overwhelmingly occupying the top 20% of the income distribution, from those Americans working in jobs that don't require skills acquired in college, who have been locked out of the top 20%. Despite working much more demanding jobs, working class Americans have been locked out of the kind of prosperity that their fellow Americans with degrees enjoy due to intentional policy put in place to make degree holders prosperous. We have become an oligarchy of the credentialed via policy put in place by those very same credentialed experts. Yet having a degree does not actually make you better able to judge which policies would be better for the nation. What it does is make people adept at figuring out which policies benefit them economically, and those are the policies that they proceeded to put in place. Thus, economists told us that mass migration raises the GDP, when all of those gains went to the upper classes, the employers of low-wage laborers, and effectively was a mass wage theft of working-class Americans. The experts told us that free trade would be great when what they meant was it would be great for them. The medical establishment told us the vaccinated couldn't catch COVID and that children were at risk of dying of COVID, and so we needed to lock down the economy, which was nonsense that led to social and economic devastation while inflating the home values of the credentialed work-from-home laptop caste. The foreign policy experts told us we needed to wage endless wars, which were often fruitless and bloody endeavors that made the world less safe and stole working class boys and girls from their parents while lining the pockets of the experts and the journalist class, the most overeducated industry in the United States, told us that every Trump voter is racist because his economic policy was putting money in the pockets of working class Americans. It is an absolute scandal that while giving us this terrible expertise, the elites were engaged in class warfare against the working class, plundering the middle class and lining their pockets with the proceeds of these policies. Back in the 1970s, the average working class person earned an income similar to that of the average college professor. The majority of the GDP, the biggest chunk of the GDP, was in the middle class. Today, the top 20% controls over 50% of the GDP, while the working class struggles to afford groceries. And it's funny because people in that top 20% in the knowledge industry, they love to rail against billionaires. You know, that's like their favorite topic is the evil billionaires. But if you compare the share of the economy that was controlled by billionaires in the 1970s to the share of the economy that is controlled by billionaires today, it really has not changed that much. So where did all of that extra GDP go? It used to be in the middle, and now it's in the top 20%. It's in people with multiple degrees in the knowledge industry. And as a distraction from all of that, they try to paint billionaires as kind of evil or as the enemy, when the truth is working class people do not have class resentment against billionaires. They often see them as jobs creators and they admire them. And so all of that class resentment is coming from the top 20% who are actually engaged in the wage theft of the working class. So how did they manage this plunder? Well, before 1970, the biggest sector of the US economy was in manufacturing. A quarter of our nation's wealth was once generated there, where workers got great health care, excellent wages, and a pension. American workers labored in factories making things like cars and homes that they and their neighbors consumed, which created a natural upper limit on their labor, which was then on prices and profit, because they were not just the producers of these cars, they were the consumers of the cars. They were the consumers of the things they were producing. And so the profits made from their labor were then reinvested into the factories and into them, the workers, to make sure that they could keep buying the things that they were making. After all, they were the biggest share of the market. That's what an economy where the biggest chunk is in manufacturing looks like. Fast forward to 2022, and the biggest share of the US economy, 1/5 of it, is in finance, real estate, insurance, arbitrage, parts of the economy that make money off Wall Street speculation rather than production, and which really cut the American worker out of the picture. So Amy, that nurse's aide who I described to you in the beginning, her nursing home was sold once, and then sold a second time, and then sold a third time, and then sold to a management company that now manages it for a bank. And all they care about is getting the costs down. And at this point, they are now feeding the residents on $1 a day per resident. $1 a day. So you can imagine what the food is like to these old people who worked very hard their whole lives, only to end up in a place where the only thing the people in charge care about is getting the prices down. $1 a day to feed these elderly people. But it's not just them. I mean, think about Amy, who without her union would be making $10 an hour. And this is a woman who spends her life gently turning over old people so they don't get bed sores every hour, and changing their diapers so they live in dignity in the final years of their lives. Why is it okay for someone doing that job to make $10 an hour? I mean, why? That shouldn't be okay with anybody. Like whether you're Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, as a society, I mean, I'm a very religious person, so I think it offends me spiritually, but even if you're not, it's, as a society, how can we say that someone who does such an important job that we would really rather not do should never be able to own a home to pass on to their children? Like that just cannot be acceptable. Sorry, I lost my place. Manufacturing today, meanwhile, makes up just 11% of today's economy. In an economy where the biggest share of the money is being made in speculation and arbitrage by a tiny percent of people who own or control most of the investments, the worker gets very little of the prosperity being generated by the sweat of his or her brow. Meanwhile, as good manufacturing jobs started to be shipped en masse overseas, the US saw a flood of immigrants willing to work for lower pay than American workers here at home. Back in 1970, the high water mark for working class wages, immigrants represented less than 5% of the total US population. Today, immigrants account for close to 16%. We're actually set to surpass the level that the last time it was this high, which was the high water mark in American history, which was the Gilded Age. Not coincidentally, a time characterized by extreme inequality. Today, immigrants account for close to 16%, closing in on the highest it's ever been, which was in 1890. Without manufacturing, American workers were left to do jobs you couldn't offshore in the service industry, which pay much less than a factory, where the worker's ability to buy what he or she makes is what keeps the lights on. And then those service industry jobs were undercut by a glut of illegal labor. You know, economists understand, like, the law of supply and demand in every other situation. The more you have of something, the less it's going to cost, except when it comes to human labor. And then suddenly they turn that off and they act like that doesn't exist. Of course it exists. If there's now 10 million people and they're going to be, localized, concentrated in certain industries, of course that's going to drive down those wages. In 1994, these trends were radically accelerated when President Bill Clinton signed the North America Free Trade Agreement, perhaps the single most impactful piece of legislation on workers over the last 50 years. As a result of this new trade deal, industrial working class jobs that secured factory workers with wages on a par with college professors were largely shipped away to China and Mexico, while the US began pursuing trade that favored workers in other countries. It resulted in decimated communities across the Rust Belt and the Midwest. And again, you look at those communities and the impact has been spiritual, psychological, as well as economic. Skyrocketing children being born out of wedlock, which just starts this downward cycle of downward mobility. These are our neighbors, and they are living lives that are impossible as a result of decisions that we made in order to create this kind of funnel of upward transfer of wealth. The right likes to point out that thanks to globalization, flat screen TVs, iPhones, and even food items are cheaper, increasing the purchasing power of working class Americans. And yet their purchasing power when it comes to securing the hallmarks of a middle class life have plummeted because the cost of those items, a home, healthcare, a dignified retirement, and education, have grown astronomically. The cost of a home has doubled in the US since 1970, though in some states, notably California and Washington, it's risen by much more, 250 and 352%, respectively. The cost of healthcare has risen, this is just staggering, from 5% of GDP in 1960 to 20% of GDP in 2021. Healthcare used to cost $146 a year per capita. It now costs $12,000 a year per capita, though we are less healthy than we have ever been before. It's staggering. And the average cost of college has jumped by 3,000%, making the average college tuition 31 times what it was in 1969. And of course, you only have to look at the protests of the last 3 weeks to answer the question, are these people any better educated? No, they're much worse educated. These aren't random ways of measuring a middle class life. When American Compass surveyed American families in 2023, they found there was broad consensus about the essential components of the American dream: comprehensive health care, owning a home, being able to support a child on one income, being able to send your kid to college if you choose. Meanwhile, a large majority felt that rising inequalities, stagnating wages, and losing the option for one parent to stay home and raise the kids was a big problem. Despite all these pressures, many Americans without a college degree are, in fact, living solidly middle-class lives, while many have lives as precarious as those of Americans living at or below the poverty line. So consider Patrick, an NYPD detective who owns his own home and whose daughter is currently in college. So Patrick is profiled at great length in the book. Patrick is a cop, but he's also an artist who spends his free time in his basement painting huge, detailed murals depicting the heartbreak of being Black and a police officer. Detective Patrick believes he's found the formula for the American dream, and it is 2 words long: hard work. If you ask him what he needs from America, he will tell you he needs nothing, but a little respect would go a long way towards making the streets safer. Now consider Maria. Maria works as a home health aide, caring for her mother-in-law in Reno. But though her mother-in-law has dementia and requires round-the-clock care, she only gets 25 hours of paid care a week, and that pays a paltry $11 an hour, which means that though Maria spends every waking hour on call or actively caring for her mother-in-law, she is forced to subsist on wages that don't begin to cover her bills. And even though her husband works for General Motors, they are constantly behind, making calls to the electric company to beg forbearance. From a certain point of view, Patrick, Amy, Linda, and Maria are all working class. They are all in professions that don't require a college degree, though Patrick has one. Yet their lives are also extremely different in ways that represent larger segments of the working class. There are 3 main groups. I call them struggling, floating, and rising. Americans like Patrick, police officers, sanitation workers, electricians, plumbers, people who work in the energy sector, and many skilled tradesfolk fall into the category of the rising working class. By and large, these are working class Americans who have accessed the American dream and are living solidly middle class lives. They own their own homes, they look forward to retiring in dignity, and their children are likely to be as financially secure as they are. There are also many working class Americans like Amy, CNAs and truckers and stockers and Amazon workers and nurses' assistants, who have enough to cover their expenses but will never be able to buy a home, that access point to the kind of financial security that will ensure their children are upwardly mobile. Many live in metro areas where the price of a home has skyrocketed, and they worry that they won't be able to retire. This is the floating working class. And by the way, this is the biggest sector of the working class. People in this group, if they live in red America, are middle class because simply they can afford to buy homes. And so the irony is that the Democrats like to talk a big game, but if you think that owning a home is a central component of the American dream, red America is doing much, much better. And then there are the working poor, struggling working class Americans, cashiers and retail salespersons, and waiters and home health aides, and fast food workers and door dashers who are the most precarious. The ranks of these workers are filled with single mothers and grandmothers, those least likely to be able to secure upward mobility for their children, people whose lives are at highest risk of violent crime or addiction, and they often lie awake at night staring at the ceiling and wondering whether the next bill that comes in will spell disaster for them and their families. These are the kinds of people you will meet in Second Class: How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. You will read about their struggles and their triumphs. You will hear in their own words whether working class Americans still have a fair shot at the American dream. And to summarize, what they told me was that hard work and personal choices can go a long way toward overcoming circumstances and larger system-wide barriers to success. But you can make all the right choices and work and work and work, and you really still only have a 50-50 shot of making it into the middle class. And that's really the tragedy of the working class struggle to achieve the American dream in the 21st century. Working class Americans have been reduced to second-class citizens, betrayed by the elites who created an economy that rewards the rich and penalizes the poor, who shrank the path to upward mobility to a narrow, precarious bridge. America, in short, has broken its contract with the working class, but we can fix it. And Second Class also has a series of totally nonpartisan policy solutions that could be enacted tomorrow, which would radically improve the lives of working class Americans. It's undeniable that in the post-pandemic world, working class wages are up, in some cases significantly. But for millions and millions of the hardest working Americans, even these better wages are vastly unequal to the cost of purchasing a middle class life, a home, a vacation here and there, the ability to retire in dignity, adequate health care, and a better future for their kids. Do working class Americans still have a fair shot at a middle class life? They do, but it's a much worse shot than it used to be, and that should be unacceptable to us all, no matter our political orientation. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.